I guess she tried to do whatever with him, it didn't work. She came back to my car still. Let's get in, let me get in the passenger seat.
You ain't free to go?
The incident begins not with lights and sirens, but with confusion. A third party places the call on Uber driver describing a woman who appears intoxicated and claims she is being kidnapped. That single allegation, broadcast through dispatch, primes every decision that follows. Before any officer arrives, the narrative is already framed: distress, danger, urgency. This is how authority enters a scene with momentum it did not earn on its own. When officers arrive, the first interaction is indirect. They speak to the driver, not the woman. The initial version of events is filtered through someone who has already disengaged and sought protection through the system. His account contains uncertainty, concern, and self-preservation. He explains erratic behavior, repeated attempts to enter vehicles, and escalating pressure. From an officer's perspective, this is not yet criminal conduct, but it is disorder. And disorder is where discretionary power thrives. The woman, meanwhile, is present but not centered. She moves in and out of focus, verbally and physically. She is intoxicated, emotionally volatile, and oscillating between fear, anger, and bravado. None of that is illegal, but it is inconvenient. And inconvenience often becomes the silent justification for control. The first decisive shift happens quickly. An officer asserts detention. The command is sharp and absolute. There is no preface, no explanation that would ground the order in observable facts. The woman resists, verbally not physically, asking why. This is a critical legal moment. The request for justification is not obstruction, it is a constitutional reflex. But the system is not built to reward that reflex in real time. From here, the tone hardens. Repetition replaces explanation. Authority is enforced through volume and proximity rather than clarity. The officer frames the interaction as an investigation, but the contours of that investigation are never articulated to the person being detained. This asymmetry officers, knowing the reason internally, while withholding it, externally creates immediate friction. The woman's compliance becomes conditional on understanding, the officer's patience becomes conditional on obedience. She eventually exits the vehicle. The detention is now physical and public. Her belongings are handled, sorted, redirected. Each movement is small, procedural, and lawful on its face. But together, they signal a loss of agency that the woman acutely feels. She is no longer a participant in a conversation, she is an object being managed. What follows is prolonged engagement without resolution. The officers do not arrest her. They do not release her. They do not transport her. Instead, they contain her. This limbo is where psychological escalation occurs. The woman talks constantly. She cycles through narratives: victimhood, defiance, identity, family, danger, power. None of it is coherent enough to resolve the situation, but all of it keeps the situation alive. The officers respond with a strategy common in these encounters: controlled tolerance. They allow speech but restrict movement. They acknowledge emotion but do not validate it. They redirect without concluding. On paper, this is de-escalation. In practice, it extends the interaction until fatigue sets in on both sides. As minutes pass, the woman's statements grow more erratic. She references violence abstractly, connections vaguely, threats inconsistently. Importantly, she does not act on them. But the language itself becomes a liability. Officers are trained to treat verbal instability as predictive risk. The threshold for intervention lowers, not because of new behavior, but because of accumulated discomfort. Throughout this period, the officers oscillate between empathy and control. They reassure her she is not being arrested, then warn her that arrest is possible. They suggest medical help, then delay it. They offer conversation, then shut it down. This inconsistency matters. For an intoxicated person, mixed signals do not calm, they destabilize. The woman repeatedly expresses a desire to go home. This is a pivotal detail. Home represents resolution without punishment. But for officers, releasing her without a clear transfer of responsibility carries risk. If she leaves and something happens, accountability flows backward. The safest institutional choice is not necessarily the least intrusive one, it is the one that minimizes future scrutiny. As the interaction drags on, the officer's language subtly shifts. They begin documenting behavior verbally on camera. Statements about her actions, her tone, her compliance are narrated aloud. This is not for her, it is for the record. The camera is no longer a passive witness. It is an active participant shaping how the encounter will later be judged. The woman senses this. She mentions recording, evidence, consequences. Her awareness of the system surfaces, but without the composure to leverage it effectively. This is another power imbalance. Knowledge without control. Eventually, the situation pivots toward enforcement. The stated reason is not the initial call, nor any new offense, but her conduct during detention. The chargeable behavior emerges from the interaction itself. This is a common pattern in police encounters involving intoxication. The original concern becomes secondary to how the person responds to authority. When officers attempt to search her mouth, the justification is framed around evidence preservation. At this point, the encounter crosses from preventive to punitive. The woman resists. Again, not violently at first, but resistance is defined broadly. The moment her compliance falters under stress, the legal language shifts decisively. Resisting without violence is a charge built for moments like this. It criminalizes hesitation, confusion, and instinctive recoil. The line between reflex and resistance is thin, and it is drawn by the person with the badge. Physical control follows quickly. The woman is restrained, her protests escalating as her options collapse. Pain enters the equation not as an accident, but as a tool. Officers instruct her to relax while applying force. This contradiction is standard, yet profoundly destabilizing. The body does not relax under pressure, it reacts. By the time she is placed in the patrol vehicle, the narrative is complete. What began as a welfare concern has become a criminal case. The charges are procedural, not predatory. They do not allege harm to others, only failure to conform, disorderly intoxication, resisting without violence. The system has transformed chaos into paperwork. What is striking is not that officers acted, but how gradually the justification for action was manufactured. Each step seemed reasonable in isolation. Together, they form a conveyor belt from contact to custody. This is not a story of a single bad decision. It is a story of cumulative ones. Of how authority, once asserted, seeks closure on its own terms. Of how intoxication erodes credibility faster than it erodes rights. Of how the absence of a clear exit strategy turns management into enforcement. In Part 2, the focus will narrow. We will examine the legal thresholds invoked and implied throughout the encounter: reasonable suspicion, detention authority, and the discretionary space officers occupy when public order and individual rights collide. The question will not be whether the woman behaved well. It will be whether the system responded proportionally once it decided she had not. By the time the interaction reaches its midpoint, the encounter has quietly crossed an invisible line. What began as a welfare response has settled into something else entirely, an open-ended detention sustained not by new facts, but by accumulated frustration. This is where legal thresholds matter most, not in theory, but in how they are stretched, blurred, and selectively enforced in real time. Reasonable suspicion is the first threshold. It allows officers to briefly detain an individual to confirm or dispel suspicions of criminal activity. In this case, the original call alleged intoxication and a claim of kidnapping. Upon arrival, officers quickly determine there is no kidnapping. The Uber driver is separated, cooperative, and eager to disengage. The woman is intoxicated, but intoxication alone is not a crime unless paired with endangerment or disorderly conduct. At that moment, reasonable suspicion weakens. The legal justification for continued detention should narrow. Instead, it expands. Officers shift focus from the original allegation to the woman's behavior during the encounter. This pivot is subtle but consequential. The investigation becomes self-referential. The longer she is detained, the more opportunities arise to interpret her reactions as justification for further detention. This is a feedback loop common in street-level policing. The subject's stress response becomes the evidence. Her agitation, fueled by confusion and intoxication, is treated as confirmation that continued control is necessary. The logic is circular but institutionally accepted. Throughout this phase, officers repeatedly assert authority without grounding it in specific, articulable facts. Commands are issued, compliance is demanded, but explanations are withheld or delayed. From a constitutional standpoint, this is where tension peaks. The law does not require officers to persuade, but it does require that detentions be reasonable in scope and duration. What is reasonable becomes increasingly subjective as minutes turn into half an hour. The woman's repeated insistence on going home is legally significant. Courts have consistently held that detention must last no longer than necessary to effectuate its purpose. Once officers determine she is not a kidnapping victim and does not pose an immediate threat, the purpose becomes murky. Is she being detained for her own safety, for public safety, for investigation of a crime that has not yet materialized? Officers appear to recognize this ambiguity. They oscillate between caretaking language and enforcement language. They mention hospitals, rides, family members' alternatives to arrest, but none are executed decisively. Each option is raised, then deferred. This indecision is not accidental. It reflects institutional risk management. Releasing an intoxicated person creates liability. Arresting her creates documentation and transfers responsibility to the jail. The path of least risk is not always the least intrusive. As the interaction continues, the woman's speech becomes increasingly erratic. She references violence, connections, and criminal activity often incoherently. Importantly, officers do not corroborate these claims, nor do they act on them directly. But the statements linger, coloring perception. In policing, perception often precedes proof. This is where disorderly intoxication enters the frame. Disorderly conduct statutes are deliberately broad. They exist to give officers discretion in ambiguous situations. Loudness, profanity, agitation, these are not crimes in isolation, but they become criminal when framed as disturbances. The woman's behavior, while disruptive, is largely verbal, yet the prolonged detention amplifies its impact. What might have dissipated if resolved quickly, instead accumulates until it appears unmanageable. Another critical moment arrives when officers begin to frame her actions verbally on camera. Statements like "you're being charged with resisting" are not reactive, they are declarative. They signal a decision point. Once an officer announces a charge, the encounter's trajectory narrows dramatically. De-escalation becomes secondary to control. The mouth search marks a legal escalation. Officers articulate concern about evidence and assertion that transforms the interaction into a custodial search context. For such a search to be lawful, there must be probable cause to believe evidence exists and is at risk of destruction. The justification here is thin, inferred from behavior rather than observed contraband. Yet in practice, such inferences are rarely challenged in the moment. When the woman resists the search, the charge of resisting without violence becomes available. This offense is uniquely powerful because it criminalizes non-compliance itself. The underlying legality of the officer's command often goes unexamined until after arrest, if at all. On the street, refusal equals resistance. The physical struggle that follows is brief but decisive. Officers apply force while instructing the woman to relax. This paradox is not merely rhetorical, it is structural. Compliance is demanded under conditions that make calm compliance neurologically difficult. The body reacts to restraint with instinctive tension, which is then interpreted as further resistance. Once handcuffed, the woman's fate is effectively sealed. Any subsequent behavior is filtered through the lens of custody. Her protests, pain, and verbal outbursts no longer influence whether she will be arrested, only how she will be charged. The system has moved from decision-making to processing. It is important to note what is absent. There is no clear moment where officers articulate probable cause for an arrest unrelated to the interaction itself. The charges arise from the encounter, not from pre-existing criminal conduct. This is not uncommon, but it raises uncomfortable questions about causality. Would these charges exist if the initial detention had been shorter, clearer, or more decisive? The post-arrest narrative reinforces institutional logic. Officers later discuss the situation in clinical terms: intoxication, unpredictability, safety concerns. These explanations are coherent and defensible. They are also retrospective. They justify actions already taken rather than guiding decisions prospectively. This retrospective framing is how systems protect themselves. Each step is explained after the fact, not interrogated at the moment it occurs. Body cameras capture behavior, but they do not capture alternatives that were never attempted. By the end of Part 2, the legal architecture of the encounter is fully visible. Discretion expands where clarity is lacking. Broad statutes absorb ambiguous behavior. Authority fills the gaps left by uncertainty. None of this requires malice. It requires only momentum and risk aversion. In Part 3, the analysis will widen again. We will examine the institutional incentives that shape encounters like this one, the downstream consequences of low-level charges, and how systems designed to manage risk often convert vulnerability into criminal liability. The focus will shift from what happened to why it keeps happening and who ultimately bears the cost. By the time the patrol car door closes, the encounter has completed its transformation. What began as a welfare check ends as a custodial arrest, supported not by the original allegation, but by the woman's inability to navigate a system that demanded clarity from someone least capable of providing it. This final phase is where individual behavior fades into the background and institutional design takes center stage. The criminal charges that emerge are revealing: disorderly intoxication, resisting an officer without violence, tampering with physical evidence. These are not crimes of intent or harm. They are crimes of friction offenses that arise when a person fails to move smoothly through an enforcement process. They criminalize disruption, not danger. The dismissal of the tampering charge later underscores this point. That allegation, framed around evidence preservation, does not survive scrutiny. Yet it still served its purpose in the moment. It justified escalation. It legitimized force. It created narrative weight when officers needed it most. Even when charges fall away, the impact of their invocation remains. This is one of the least examined realities of modern policing. Charges do not need to hold up in court to shape outcomes on the street. They only need to be plausible enough to move the encounter forward. The arrest itself becomes the consequence, regardless of eventual adjudication. The woman's intoxication is central, but not in the way it is often portrayed. Alcohol does not merely impair judgment, it amplifies emotional responses and reduces the ability to interpret authority cues. In this state, consistency is critical. Yet the encounter is defined by inconsistency, mixed messages, shifting goals, delayed decisions. Each inconsistency compounds confusion, which then masquerades as defiance. From an institutional standpoint, officers are operating under a familiar constraint: liability. Releasing an intoxicated person carries risk. Transporting her to a hospital carries cost and time. Arresting her transfers responsibility to another system entirely. In risk-averse environments, transfer is often mistaken for resolution. This is not about individual officers choosing punishment over care. It is about systems that reward containment over discretion. Officers are evaluated on outcomes that can be documented: arrests made, reports filed, not on harm avoided through non-action. The safest choice for the institution is often the most restrictive one for the individual. Once arrested, the woman's narrative becomes irrelevant. Her explanations, fears, and protests no longer influence the process. The system now speaks for her through charging documents and incident reports. Her voice is preserved on bodycam, but it is no longer authoritative. Interpretation belongs to others. The downstream consequences of this arrest are not trivial. Even low-level convictions carry weight. Court appearances, fines, probation conditions, and criminal records all follow. These consequences disproportionately affect people already operating at the margins: those with unstable housing, mental health challenges, or substance use issues. The system does not correct these vulnerabilities, it codifies them. What is most striking is how little had to go wrong for this outcome to occur. There is no singular act of brutality, no explicit violation of policy, no clear moment of malice. Instead, there is a steady accumulation of small decisions, each defensible in isolation. This is how institutional harm often functions: not through dramatic failure, but through normalized procedure. The body camera captures everything, yet resolves nothing. It documents behavior without context, escalation without alternatives. Viewers see what happened, but not what could have happened. They see enforcement, not the paths not taken. One such path is rapid resolution. Had officers decisively arranged safe transport early through a sober third party or medical assistance, the encounter might have ended quietly. Another path is clear communication. Explicitly stating the legal basis for detention, the conditions for release, and the consequences of non-compliance can anchor even intoxicated individuals. These options are known. They are taught. They are simply harder to execute under pressure. Instead, the encounter drifts. Drift is dangerous in policing. It allows authority to harden without intention. It allows patience to erode invisibly. By the time officers act decisively, the only remaining decisiveness is force. The woman's behavior, particularly her verbal aggression, will dominate public discussion. It always does. But focusing solely on her conduct misses the structural lesson. Systems are designed to absorb dysfunction from citizens, not mirror it. When they mirror it, when chaos is met with procedural rigidity rather than adaptive response, the outcome is predictable. This case also illustrates the asymmetry of accountability. The woman faces charges, convictions, and lasting records. The officers face review only if conduct is egregious, which it is not by narrow policy standards. The system does not ask whether the encounter could have ended differently. It asks only whether rules were technically followed. This is how patterns persist. Each incident is treated as isolated, contextualized by unique circumstances. Yet the contours repeat: intoxication, prolonged detention, verbal resistance, arrest. The repetition is not coincidental. It is structural. There is a quiet tragedy in how authority narrows as it asserts itself. The more control officers exercise, the fewer options remain. By the end of the encounter, arrest is not chosen because it is best, but because it is all that is left. In the final moments, officers reflect on the situation with calm detachment. They describe the woman as unpredictable, possibly under the influence of more than alcohol. These assessments may be accurate, but accuracy does not equal inevitability. Predictability is not destiny. What this encounter ultimately reveals is not a failure of individuals, but a failure of design. A system optimized for control struggles with care. A system trained to neutralize threats struggles with ambiguity. And when faced with vulnerability that does not fit neatly into either category, it defaults to criminalization. The woman leaves the scene in custody, but the larger issue remains unresolved. Intoxication will recur. Confusion will recur. Police will continue to be the default responders to social crises they are not equipped to resolve. And until institutional incentives change, these encounters will continue to end the same way, not because they must, but because the system knows no other ending. This is the quiet lesson embedded in the footage. Not outrage, not absolution, but recognition. Recognition that accountability is not only about punishing misconduct, but about interrogating the structures that make certain outcomes feel inevitable. Until that interrogation occurs, the bodycam will keep recording and the story will keep repeating.